Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's call. It's 2:32. We have a large call today. We have over 700 people registered. I'm going to give it at least another minute to allow more people to join before we get started. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm going to give it another minute or so just to allow for more people to join before we get started. Thanks for putting your hellos and your places in the chat box. A reminder that as people have questions throughout the call, you can please put them in the Q&A box or comments in the chat box, and we will be getting started soon. Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. I'm Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. I want to join you, welcome you, and thank you for joining today's call for our HoUSed campaign for universal, stable, affordable homes. I'm energized by how active all of you are on this call. Thanks for putting in your hellos and where you're calling in from in the chat box. It's great to see you all. We have an exciting and busy call today. We just wrapped up part of our day of action for Valentine's Day. So happy Valentine's Day to everybody. And thanks for showing housing love in our tweet storm, which just finished at 2. And we had great participation. So thanks to all of you that participated, to our federal, state, and local partners, and to the many members of Congress who tweeted their support for affordable housing investments in the Build Back Better Act. We saw tweets from Representatives Chuy Garcia and Sylvia Garcia, Representative Grijalva, Welch, Richie Torres, Mike Quigley, Representative Schakowsky, Soto, Bowman, Cleaver, Troy Carter, Ruben Gallego, Representative Juan Vargas, Escobar, Representative Bonnie Watson-Cole. We heard from Representative Tonko, McCollum, Nikema Williams, Dwight Evans, Madeline Dean, Senators Brown, the Banking Committee, Democrats, Senator Cardin, and many more. So we had really great participation, and we're grateful for all of the members of Congress who participated. And we're especially grateful for the leadership of Chairwoman Maxine Waters, who led the House Financial Services Committee members today in that day of action, in getting out those tweets and showing that support for these essential housing investments in the Build Back Better Act. And of course, for her leadership in getting the Build Back Better Act to this place. Just as a reminder to everybody on the call, there's $150 billion in the Build Back Better Act for housing investments. And those investments are at high risk of being cut or even eliminated. And we need focused, loud advocacy now more than ever. Those investments, you all know how essential they are. You know what's at stake. And so today's day of action, and every day until it passes, is about reminding members of Congress how essential these investments are, what this $150 billion in affordable housing funding can do. It includes $65 billion for public housing repairs and preservation, to make nearly 1 million affordable homes that house predominantly people of color to be decent, quality, accessible homes. The bill includes $25 billion in rental assistance for over 300,000 new housing choice vouchers. It includes $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund to build or preserve over 150,000 homes affordable to the lowest income people. And taken together, it is the single largest investment in quality, affordable, accessible homes for the country's lowest income people in history. It is a once in a lifetime opportunity to get this level of investments done. And we can't and we won't allow these housing investments to stall or to be left behind. Not when homelessness is increasing, when rents are rising, public housing is deteriorating, and millions of the lowest income tenants are struggling just to keep a roof over their heads. We have to keep pushing Congress and President Biden to enact this once in a lifetime investment and opportunity to address homelessness, repair and preserve public housing, and put the country on a path towards universal housing assistance. We can't allow them to miss it. We have great support from people across the country, many of you who are on the line today, over 1,800 organizations across the country that have joined our call for these crucial housing investments. All these congressional champions that I named who have been fighting to keep these housing investments in a final bill. And your advocacy is working, but we're not done yet. So we've certainly come too far to give up now. We need you to keep calling, keep tweeting, keep writing your members of Congress, urging them to protect the bill's historic affordable housing investments. So I just want to check and see if our first guest, Chairwoman Waters, has joined. I know she's been on the road and she'll be joining momentarily. Okay, it looks like she will be coming in just a moment or two. So I will just take that moment or two again to thank you all for all of the work that you've done throughout the year to get us to this place, and to remind you that there have been some conversations about the possibility of really significantly narrowing the size and the scope of the Build Back Better Act to get it to a place where Senators Joe Manchin and Sinema would be willing to vote for it. And most of those discussions mention a few investments that would be likely to be included, like investments for climate change, investments potentially for pre-K, some investments to lower medical costs. But in most of the conversations, those housing investments are not named, whether by members of the media or by some members of Congress who put forward their proposed compromises. And what you'll hear some say is that whatever's not included in this scaled back Build Back Better Act could be moved forward as a standalone bill. And it's very important for everybody to realize that a standalone bill has virtually no chance of being enacted this year, both because it would require 10 Republicans to vote yes and support the legislation, and because there is very limited floor time in the House and especially in the Senate this year, because it is an election year. And every day we get closer to the election, it becomes less and less likely that any major legislation can be enacted, and especially any kind of standalone legislation. So that's not an adequate fallback position or an adequate alternative for the housing investments. They must be included in any scaled back, Build Back Better legislation that moves forward. I'm just going to pause and see. I think we are being joined now. Wonderful. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, today was just one example of Chairwoman Waters' leadership, where we saw most of the House Financial Services Democrats getting on Twitter, raising their voices to talk about how essential these housing investments are. And Chairwoman Waters is an outspoken and strong advocate for affordable housing and ending homelessness, and has been for decades. She's a powerful congressional leader as chair of the House Financial Services Committee. In this position, she's advanced major legislation, most recently the American Rescue Plan and other COVID-19 relief packages, which included her legislation to provide $46 billion to help people struggling to pay the rent, and an additional $14 billion for people experiencing homelessness. And just as we did in 2020 and 2021, NLIC is committed to working with Chair Waters to achieve major housing investments from her Housing as Infrastructure Act and her Ending Homelessness Act in the Build Back Better bill. So we are so thrilled to have you, Chairwoman Waters, back on our national call. It is, as always, really an honor to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so very, very much. As I sat down and I was listening to part of your presentation, I could not help but think about the position that we find ourselves in the federal government of the United States of America, and particularly as we think about, review, and long for the passage of Build Back Better. You know, I think that one of the things that I believe we should remember is that this administration has been wonderful in relationship to responding to the pandemic. And, you know, whether we're talking about the CARES Act or whether we're talking about the American Rescue Plan, I think we need to always remember and remind folks that the investments that we've made to stabilize families and to ensure a decent quality of life for so many individuals, so many families in this country, that this work has been able to maintain families not only with a decent quality of life, but we have inspired them to understand what government is possible, what government can do, and what is possible if government is taking the absolute leadership to continue the kind of work that we have already started. Now, even though we're not focused on, the two individuals in the Senate who appear to hold up our ability to pass the Build Back legislation without good reason, and we don't understand exactly what the excuses are. As a matter of fact, Manchin said that he couldn't explain it. Well, if you can't explain Build Back Better, you can't explain anything. And this idea of I can't go home and tell the people what Build Back Better is all about is baffling, and it is not to be understood. And with Sinema, I don't know what the excuses are. I don't know exactly what she's saying. I've never understood the reasoning, but I do know this. It is extraordinarily painful for us to be in the position to undo some of the harm that was caused by the past president, to understand what was needed and what is still needed in this pandemic, and not be able to put the bills on the president's desk. It takes 2 votes. And of course, we have our vice president who can break the tie, and we can do what we need to do. And so all of this discussion about whether or not we continue to focus on trying to get Build Back Better, whether or not we break it up into pieces and parts, is the kind of discussion that seemingly believes that no matter what we do, we can't be successful. I want you to know that we have not always had the support that we needed for housing, because there's some who thought, well, you know, CARES Act, we've done a lot to support housing. But of course, yes, a lot has been done, but a lot more is needed. Housing is in a crisis in this country. Housing is in a crisis. And with inflation, the leasing and rental prices are escalating. The down payments on homes and the ability to negotiate, you know, a decent mortgage price. They're all problems that we have to, you know, not only understand, but articulate and help people to know that we're not just, you know, pushing for additional housing and more money for housing because we don't have anything else to do. We're doing this because people are still on the streets. We're doing this because families and friends are doubling up, you know, 2 families to a household. Our young people are doubling up 4 and 5 to 2-bedroom rentals, et cetera, et cetera. In the Build Back Better bill, we really do take a serious look at what we can do for housing vouchers. Of course, we wanted a lot more, but I believe that $25 billion that we put into Build Back Better is going to be very helpful to so many people who have been standing in line. I believe that that 65 or 70 billion or so that we put in to deal with public housing is so important. It is so important because elevators are broken, garbage disposal systems are down. And this last winter, I got a call from my colleague who said she was in one of the public housing buildings and the heat was off because it was broken. And so it's so important in Build Back Better that we take care of the least of these. People who are living in public housing, struggling every day. Some people who are on minimum wage, others on welfare, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to that, we work with the cities on the home program. We work with them to make sure that they continue to have flexibility to deal with the CDBG money for housing in ways that was so desperately needed. The National Housing Trust Fund has been neglected for years. Bonnie Frank and I worked on that, and we had great hopes that we were going to expand the ability to build low-income housing. Well, that's all in Build Back Better. And we've got to fight with every inch of our lives. We've got to fight for it. We've got to organize. We've got to make sure that while all this talk about breaking up perhaps into smaller packages may be floating around, I believe that some of the same thinking that says, well, you know, we've done quite a bit for housing. There are other areas that we have to deal with. Well, yeah, we have a lot of areas to deal with. We want adequate childcare. We want adequate parental leave. We want to make sure that, you know, people are able to have access to the medicine that they need, and on and on and on. We can't leave any of this out, but we certainly can't put housing at the bottom of the list somehow and say we've done enough. Right here in my own county, 60,000 people are out on the street every night. No place to live, living in cars, children trying to go to school, living in cars, automobiles, and et cetera, et cetera. So with that, I know that I wasn't supposed to take up all of this time, but of course, that's where my heart and my mind is right now. And I'm in a fighting mood, and I'm not walking away, and I'm not ready for a compromise that's not a real compromise, something thrown at us. So with that, I'll take any questions that you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chairwoman Waters, and thank you for those words. We share your frustration, and I can imagine how much you feel it, given how, as chair of the House Financial Services Committee, you led the way towards drafting the Build Back Better Act's housing provisions with initially over $300 billion in housing investments, which is just completely unprecedented. And then when Senator Manchin insisted that the top line number be reduced, you led the fight to ensure that those funds remained, ultimately $150 billion, still historic, still unprecedented. So we know how much you shared our frustration when Senator Manchin said he wouldn't vote for Build Back Better. So it does seem now that a smaller, a more narrow deal is possible. So how can we together ensure that any newly negotiated bill keeps that $150 billion in housing investments? And what do you think is the path forward to enactment?
Well, let me just say the first thing that we've got to know and understand for sure: who's negotiating, when are they negotiating, what the next meetings are, because we have to be on top of that. For the negotiators, whether it's the four corners or the six corners or whatever they want to refer to, we've got to speak with each one of the people on both the House and the Senate. And these negotiators got to know what we're saying, what we are holding on to, what we're fighting for, because oftentimes the negotiators never get directly talked to. They don't have to look us in the eye and say that they won't support what we're advocating for. So let's know for sure who's negotiating. Let's know for sure who the top staff people are who are working with the negotiators and taking the information back and forth between the negotiators. We've got to know what this timing is. We know that right now, there's a lot of focus on Ukraine and Russia, and we know that there's a lot of focus basically on what we're going to do to continue to fund the government, et cetera, et cetera. But we can't let that get in the way of us being able to track down and talk to these negotiators who are in the back room cutting the final deal. I am going to be an advocate. Others are going to be an advocate as we also, send the messages, use the platforms, the social media platforms, talk with all of our organizations, et cetera. But, I want to know what room they're in, what time of day. I have been known to visit meetings uninvited, and I have no problems continuing to do that and to let you know where they are in case you want to visit with me and knock on the door.
We'll be right by your side. Yeah, and what else? What other advice could you give us, to everybody that's on the line? You have housing advocates, organizers, impacted people from all over the country, many from your community on the line today. People are putting in the chat box and the Q&A box their thanks to you and their question to you of what more can we do to help you in your fight for these housing investments?
Well, let me thank you for all that you do. Without you, I would not have been able to get the 150 billion that we got. And, as you said, when we came out of my committee, we were over 300 billion and we had to fight hard, and you were right there. Your organization, all of the organizations were right there with us fighting to ensure. And by the time we came out with 150 billion, I want you to know that there was some thinking that we weren't going to get anything, that housing was not going to be a part of the agenda. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Keep your voices up. Stay in touch with the offices. The pandemic has its working in such a different way. And of course, it's not easy for everybody to get on a plane or get on a train and get here and, try and overwhelm the halls with our presence, et cetera, et cetera. But we can use the internet as much as we possibly can. We can have the local groups go and knock on the doors of elected officials in their communities and stay there and have them understand what we're doing and what we're working for. We can continue to do everything that we can to get the message to the White House. We can see right now, it appears that there may be some breaks in the Republican Party based on the fights that they're having inside the party about the censuring of the two members of the January 6th committee that have basically continued to say that the president is not telling the truth about election fraud, and that he has more involvement in it than a lot of people have known. And in addition to that, when the ex-vice president came out, Pence, it helped to drive a bit of a wedge in the Republican Party. So let's take a close look at the Republican Party members and see if we can find anything in their statements or their backgrounds. And instead of staying away from them, let's move on them. And let's move on them and ask them, because some of them maybe don't know the housing needs in their own district. We have discovered over and over again that many of the districts who have poor people, who have working people who are making minimum wage, who get up and go to work every day and can't afford to pay rent, we know that those people are there. And sometimes they act as if they don't know. But let's send them the information. Let's mail to them how many people they have that are homeless, how many people they have who have had to have rental assistance, what communities they're in, how many children are suffering. Let's broaden our advocacy. In some places, we haven't spent any time or much time because we didn't believe it would do any good. But Manchin needs to know there's parts of his district that really needs Build Back Better. And so, if it was left up to me, the Democratic caucus would go and stand in every supermarket, every public place, and pass out the flyers that explain exactly what it means and what this child care tax credit is all about, to be renewed, et cetera, et cetera. So any local action with bodies that are not putting themselves in harm's way, that are able to visit the local elected officials or do some precinct work like we do in campaigns, where you might want to identify an area that you want to disseminate some information in. So let's broaden our efforts, continue what we're doing with the people we know support us and have supported us, keep them strong, keep them willing to hang in there, and let's continue to put pressure on Manchin and on Sinema, and see if we can find one or two more over there that we might be able to pressure a little bit or leverage something.
It's great advice, Chairwoman. We'll follow it, and we will keep pushing in all the ways we can to get this bill across the finish line. I know you're just about, you maybe are over time. Do you have time for one last question? Just one last question. You have been such an incredible lifelong champion for these critical housing investments, these investments to address homelessness, to repair public housing, put the country on a path towards universal housing assistance. You're an inspiration to just about everybody on this call and far beyond. And so I would love if you could just, in the remaining minutes you have left, tell us why you see these investments as so central to your and the progressive agenda.
Well, thank you for allowing me to share a few of my lingering thoughts with you about housing, about poverty, about people who work every day and can't earn enough money to take care of their families. I think many of you know my history, and I come from a huge family. There were 13 of us in my family, and we lived in low-income housing. Most of the time I was with my family with inadequate space, usually 1 or 2 bedrooms for most of the family. And even after I was gone, the family lived in public housing. I had some family who lived in the infamous Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, Missouri, and the Bond and the Car Square Village and those places. And I know that but for public housing, the people who were the beneficiaries would be on the street, but for public housing. There was no other place to go. And so I do have a real feel for it. And I see today, even in public housing, that there are people who are struggling and oftentimes living in inadequate public housing that needs to be repaired and renovated, and children are playing in dangerous places where they could get harmed because of the lack of the upkeep of the buildings and the grounds, et cetera, et cetera. So it's personal. It is because of life's experiences. It is because I believe so thoroughly that the richest country in the world needs to do something as basic as ensure that there's safe and public housing for all of its people. And so that's some of what stays with me constantly. I never forget from whence I came, and I never forget the people who is today living in some of the same situations and similar situations to those that we experienced when I was just a young child.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, and even more, thank you for sharing your expertise and for your incredible leadership in getting these investments enacted. We are with you all the way. We need to get this done this year. We're so grateful that you are the leading champion on the Hill for these investments. Somebody wrote in the chat box, "We're so glad you're on our side because we'd be in big trouble if you weren't." So thank you so much.
What John Lewis said, good trouble. Yes.
That's right. That's right. Thanks so much for your time, and thanks for joining again today. Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye. All right, how wonderful to have Chairwoman Waters with us again today. So grateful as always for her tremendous leadership. I am pleased now to move to our next agenda item and welcome Sarah Hastmer from National Women's Law Center to the call. Sarah's here to talk about the U.S. Census Pulse Survey data on housing and security and a new analysis of what it means. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Diane, and I am honored to have followed the Chairwoman Waters for today's very important presentation. Next slide, please. And one more, I think. One more. There we go. So before I go into our latest Census Household Pulse Survey data analysis, I wanted to share some context, which I'm sure lots of folks on this call know about already, but we partnered with NLIHC to analyze some 2019 cost burden data. And so before the pandemic, we discovered that single women renters were about 1.5 times more likely than single white non-Hispanic renters to spend the majority of their income on housing. And that stat goes up to twice as likely for women of color and women raising children on their own. And so we know that going into the COVID-19 pandemic, that racial and gender inequities in housing security existed. And we also know it existed in our economic systems. So it was no surprise that the economic impact of COVID-19 disproportionately harmed women of color. Next slide, please. Yes, and more likely to be evicted, as someone mentioned in the chat. So we'll put this link in the chat shortly, but our recent Census Household Pulse Survey was from the December 1st to 13th, 2021 survey. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a lag in the release of the data files that we can use for the gender plus race crosstab analysis, but this data still gives more real-time data than more annual like poverty data, for example. So in this December survey, Black non-Hispanic women and Latinas were more likely than white non-Hispanic men to have 1, lost employment income in the last 4 weeks, 2, be behind on their rent, and 3, be behind on their mortgage payments. We also, our research team also found that Black non-Hispanic women, Latinas, and white non-Hispanic women were more likely than white non-Hispanic men to be in households that received an advanced child tax credit payment. So those were those monthly payments that sadly stopped at the end of December. Next slide, please. And our research team found that food was the most common expense for the use of those advanced CTC payments, but also 36.6% of Black non-Hispanic women and 38.6% of Latinas who received an advanced CTC payment did use some of their payment for rent. So that goes to the importance of Build Back Better and getting that extension for the enhanced CTC payments back. But next slide, please. We also know that the enhanced CTC isn't enough alone. We need a both and approach. For a lot of things, as Chairwoman Waters mentioned, we need the enhanced CTC and housing investments. We also need childcare, which is a very hefty expense for families as well. And childcare workers are facing poverty wages, which makes it harder for them to afford housing. So in early December, our research team found that over 5 million women were behind on their rent. And this stat is actually increasing a bit from what we found earlier in 2021. We also know that Black non-Hispanic women renters continue to face the highest rates of being behind on rent at 30.9%. Latina renters followed with 19.6% compared to 8.6% of white non-Hispanic male renters and 10.5% of white non-Hispanic women renters being behind on rent. Next slide, please. As you all know, Congress passed over $46 billion for emergency rental assistance programs, but unfortunately some programs such as that in my county have stopped or paused accepting applications despite the persistent need for assistance to renters behind on rent. Part of the challenge is that the initial ERA 1 allocations weren't distributed entirely based on renter needs. We know there wasn't the national infrastructure to administer such a big renter program, but still some ERA programs learned lessons to get help to renters quickly and equitably while others were still lacking. And our research team found that among renters, about 29.4% of Black non-Hispanic women and 19.4% of Latinas reported applying for ERAP. And that percentage is higher than for white men and women, which aligns fairly well with the behind on rent breakdowns that we showed on the previous slide. But unfortunately, we know that there's not enough data to run a gender plus race crosstab on answers to the Census House poll survey, such as applied and received assistance, or applied and waiting for assistance, and applied and denied. So with about 31% of Black non-Hispanic women and about 20% of Latino renters being behind on rent, we know for sure that there's still a lot more work to do to address both immediate and long-term housing insecurity for women of color. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, we also have gender and racial disparities in our economic systems that impact housing security. In early December, 24.7% of Latinas and about 20% of Black non-Hispanic women reported losing employment income in the last 4 weeks. Next slide. And we also know that overall employment rates mask gender and racial disparities. So for example, in the January jobs report that just came out, among people aged 20 and older in the workforce, 5.8% of Black women and 4.9% of Latinas were unemployed, compared to 3.1% of white women and 3.2% of white men. And I will add a note that I don't have it here, but historically, women with disabilities and men with disabilities also face higher unemployment rates, as well as a big supply gap in accessible housing. So we're aware of that intersection as well. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a couple slices of our research team's analysis of census household pulse surveys, one from 2020 and another from 2021. It may be small, but the link that we put in the chat can go to all of our fact sheets of this research. And so one noteworthy thing is that Black non-Hispanic women renters have continuously faced the highest rates of being behind on rent. And to sum it up, this data shows how housing insecurity remains. Next slide, please. So ERAP outreach continues to be important, as well as quickly processing ERA applications. Another thing to consider, given the high rates, especially of Black and Latino women being behind on rent, is to consider permitting people to reapply if they fall behind on rent again. I know this has come up for a number of different ERA programs across the nation. We also know that some of these behind on rent increases come from gender and racial disparities in our employment system, such as higher unemployment, but much of the problem stems also from unaffordable rent costs and too little long-term rental assistance. So that is why it is so important, as we've all been saying, to continue advocating for long-term rental assistance, including vouchers, public housing, and National Housing Trust Fund investments in the next iteration of Build Back Better. And I will also add quickly that local efforts, such as limits on rent cap increases, can also be critical to address the rising rent costs across the nation. And with that, happy to take any questions folks have.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That's a really helpful overview. I see that Elena dropped the link to the analysis in the chat box. And Sarah, I would invite you to drop it again if you'd like, or any other materials. I haven't seen any direct questions related to your presentation, but there's been a really rich conversation in the chat box about the findings. Several people who have experienced much of what you laid out, sharing some of their experiences. And I certainly agree with all of the policy recommendations you include. Let me just check the question box again. A few people asking again for the presentation. So we'll be sure to share that. And Sarah, thank you again for the analysis and thanks for sharing it on today's call.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, now it looks like I'm turning to my colleague, Tori Beret, who's an Erase project coordinator at NLIC. Tori?
Thanks, Diane. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to share with you all that we have Helen Renfrew on the call. She's with the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness, as well as the Balance of State for Alaska. And she's going to be talking a little bit about some exciting program changes that the Alaska ERA program has made. So Helen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tori. So recently, the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation began using the flexibilities that are built into ERA2 to begin an innovative and bold housing program using those funds. It's called the Housing Stabilization and Recovery Program. The program dates are anticipated to be from February 1st of this year through September 30th of 2023. And this program is focused on those who are truly the most vulnerable in Alaska. It contains transitional housing, time for stabilization, and then emergency rental assistance. Right now, we have over 23 organizations participating in the program, with preliminary funding available to assist approximately 900 people and the ability to scale up if needed. Navigators from those organizations will identify clients and can move them into transitional housing, which we anticipate to be hotels immediately. Clients can stay in transitional housing for 3 months while they stabilize and access services, and there's a budget of $8,000 per household for stabilization. The goal at the end of the stabilization period is to have a housing unit leased and provide the client with 12 months of emergency rental assistance. Our target groups for this program are those folks sleeping outside, in vehicles, or in other places not meant for human habitation, those people sleeping in shelter or mass care, individuals escaping domestic violence, and victims of human trafficking. Visual and verbal confirmation of any of the above categories and an attestation that the client makes less than 80% of AMI serve as fact-based proxies for program eligibility. There will be additional paperwork and applications for services that need to be filled out for referrals, but those can wait until the client has spent some time stabilizing. Navigator organizations need to do some preliminary work in order to make sure that we have transitional spots available before we begin outreach to actual clients. But just to reiterate the timeline, clients can be moved immediately into housing to stabilize. Stabilization, access to services and supports will occur over the 3 months in transitional housing, during which time the client will begin a housing search and receive light touch case management. Once the client is stabilized and has found housing, they will receive 12 months of emergency rental assistance. So over the course of the total 15 months in the program, the aim is to, if possible, help the client to be self-sufficient. If additional housing assistance is going to be needed after the 15 months, refer the client to an appropriate program. And if the client will need more extensive case management and services, refer the client to permanent supportive housing. So this program has the capacity to make one of the most impact of any program in Alaska in order to get folks off the streets and out of shelter and into homes. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. And I want to I appreciate that update. I appreciate your good work even more. And I want to congratulate you on doing such a good, important job of targeting these resources to the lowest income people, the most marginalized people with the greatest immediate needs, for using fact-based proxies as eligibility, for limiting documentation, really good, important work. We have a couple questions here. One is asking if you could explain more on who are the navigators. Are they outreach workers? Are they CBOs? Are they someone else?
So in addition to the funds available for the program itself, we of course will get administrative funds that will help organizations to deploy the program, and navigators will work for the organizations that are located in various communities throughout the state. So it'll be those folks and those organizations who know the people that they'll be working with, have relationships with those people who are sleeping unsheltered or in shelter. And if those organizations need to scale up, need to build capacity to be able to increase their outreach, then there are funds available to do that as well.
Great, thanks, Helen. And Barbara Dunn is asking, she mentions that you said you're able to help 900 individuals, and she wonders if you know how many people aren't able to get assistance, whether lack of resources or your inability to reach them.
Yeah, of course, we don't have specific numbers on that because it's hard to count people that you can't count or that you don't know of or who do not interact with other existing systems currently. I can tell you in Anchorage, the estimate for unsheltered and in mass care individuals is somewhere between 1,050 and 1,200. So I don't know exactly how many we will not be able to help. The other thing is that if this program goes well and we can actually find housing for the individuals that are currently in the budget, then we can always look at expanding the program. And I do want to acknowledge the fact that it's really Alaska Housing Finance Corporation who has developed the program and who is really focused on targeting those individuals who are really, really the most at need in all communities across Alaska.
Mhm. Thank you. And Tony Coral Evans says this sounds like an amazing program and asks if the program is available for survivors of intimate partner violence.
Yes, but they do have to be actively trying to escape that domestic violence, that intimate partner violence.
Okay, and then a question about funding for this. I assume most of it is ERA, but are there other funding sources as well?
There's some of the housing assistance program funding that comes to Alaska Housing Finance Corporation through the state of Alaska. There's a little bit of ERA1 funds that are being used because they're still available, but really the primary funding source for this program, with all the flexibilities that were built into it, is coming from ERA2, from the from ARPA.
Very good. Thank you, Helen. I don't see any of the other specific questions, but do take a look at the chat box. There's many people thanking you and congratulating you on your good work. So thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you, Diane.
Take care. All right, now we're going to move into our field update section of the agenda, and we'll hear first from Rebecca Hollenbach, Executive Administrator with the Louisville Metro Department of Public Health and Wellness, and Deborah Payne, a Policy Analyst with Louisville Metro Department of Public Health and Wellness. Deborah and Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi all, my name is Rebecca Hollenbach. Sorry, I'm having some trouble with my camera registering, otherwise I would be on video. But thank you for, hopefully y'all can hear me okay. Thank you for having us here today. If you go to the next slide, I'll just give you a little bit more background on who the Center for Health Equity is. So we are part of local government. We were founded in 2006, and we're part of the Department of Public Health and Wellness, which is part of Louisville Metro government. So we are a government organization, and we're actually the first type of Center for Health Equity to exist in the nation. And generally, the work that we do is to try to understand racism and health inequities through the lens of public health. So a lot of the work that we do is thinking about data, strategic partnerships, community voice programs, and policies to advance equity. Recently, we have been the recipient of a CDC grant, a Centers for Disease Control grant, that has really allowed us to expand our staff capacity. As we know, COVID-19 has really highlighted a lot of the inequities that our residents are facing. And as such, we felt it was important for us to allocate even more resources to addressing root causes of health. And so we've been able to expand a lot of our teams. So adding additional policy analysts, data folks, community engagement folks. And so if you go to the next slide, a lot of the work that we do kind of focuses around this tree metaphor that kind of helps connect things like housing to health outcomes. So while we are traditionally in the field of public health, where we might look at data around things like diabetes, heart disease, life expectancy, asthma, lead poisoning, we also recognize that the patterns that we see in those areas did not come to be by accident or by behavior alone. And so we dig deeper into kind of understanding the root causes of health and thinking about what are the ways that patterns in housing or transportation or the environment or employment are shaping these patterns we see in health outcomes. And we also realize that the root causes themselves don't just have those patterns by accident either, and that the way that people have made decisions has contributed to the intentional patterning of scarcity and abundance in our community. And so we also try to explicitly address the influence, for example, that racism or classism or sexism have had in shaping the world as we see it. So we try to really take a holistic, I would say, health in all policies approach of understanding how decisions that seem like they may or may not be related to health actually are related to health. So if you go to the next slide, one of the tools that we use to help people understand these patterns and how they show up in our community is through things like the health impact assessment. So the health impact assessment is a tool. It is an entire discipline and area of work. It combines a lot of different types of methodologies in order to evaluate the potential health impacts of some sort of decision before it's implemented. So the decision could be something like a project, for example, building something in a certain place. It could be something like a policy where it's saying if we increase the funding to this particular program, what would be the impact? So the goal is to kind of identify what would be the positive or negative health impacts and then provide recommendations around how you could mitigate that. The health impact assessment itself is kind of a six-step process. So we start by always talking to community members and organizations that are in the policy field to better understand what decisions are on the table and what we might have the best chance of influencing. And then from there, we try to pull together various forms of data. So this could be literature reviews, this could be secondary data like the census data. It could be data that we collect ourselves, like interviews, focus groups, surveys, and we combine all of that together to help us have an understanding of how these things would be linked and what the potential impacts are. And then we usually then use them in some sort of advocacy or education efforts where people can understand that. So we're here today to present on a specific one that we have released. There is a proposed bill in this legislative session. But if you ever wanted to read others of them, you can visit hialu.com. And one thing I'll say as well is that while the data, some of the data are specific to Kentucky, there are also a lot of pieces of it that are still relevant to the entirety of the US, especially some of the literature review work that we do around linking certain policies or practices to health outcomes. And so even though there might be things that are specific to Louisville or Kentucky, there may still be things that are relevant for you all in the area that you work as well. So I'm going to pass it over to Deborah, who can tell you more about the specific findings in this particular health impact assessment.
Thank you, Rebecca. Next slide, please. So after doing having some conversations with Kentucky's housing advocates, we found that House Bill 86 was going to be a key piece of legislation that would benefit from information, particularly focused on health. This is the Kentucky's Affordable Housing Tax Credit policy that is currently in legislation right now. And it would create a maximum credit of $12.5 million per year over the course of 6 years, with an estimated addition of about 6,560 additional units. So this program basically doubles existing federal dollars to match and increase a very major shortfall in our housing across Kentucky. Next slide, please. So this was a particular flow chart that we often use with health impact assessment to help start making the connections between a policy, which may not seem like it has any connection to health, to actual direct health outcomes. I'll choose a pathway here just so that you can have a point of context. We're looking at a change in policy in affordable housing tax credits. And we know that if there's more access to housing, we have increased access to discretionary money. And this may seem like a really basic idea, but we do know that there's a direct correlation between someone's income and their ability to have a healthy life. And so when someone has more access to money, they have more access to nutritious foods, they have more access to healthcare, they have more access to money for the utilities, which maintains a healthy environment in the house. And then as you move along, you see that there are intermediate outcomes that lead to a health outcome of changes in cardiovascular health from having better health, access to food, changes in immune systems, and that people can stay healthier when they have access to health care. We also know that affordable housing has a strong influence on healthy housing in terms of one's environment. And when someone has access to safe sanitary housing, they reduce their exposure to lead paint, to mold, to other kinds of environmental issues that can cause respiratory or cardiovascular illnesses. Lead poisoning is a major issue in our housing quality issues here in Louisville and our older housing stock. So this is a quick snapshot that this kind of flow chart can just help make the basic connections when we're trying to connect the dots from a change in policy to a health outcome. Next slide. So out of a health impact assessment, you ultimately are trying to inform and help influence a change in policy. So the recommendations that we focused on both included information about the particular policy, but also we looked at a broader scope. Our main recommendation was to expand housing for Kentucky residents earning up to 60% area median income. But we also recognize that while this particular bill targets that population, there is a major need for housing along the entire spectrum. So looking for we also recommend looking at ways to expand housing for low-income families and increasing awareness of benefits of affordable housing along the continuum. We know that we can't transitions from having no housing to up to someone with 60% AMI is a big jump. So finding ways to help people move along that process is very important. We also found that there was not enough research, which is also a common issue with anytime you delve into something where there's disparity. So looking at ways that research can help inform affordable housing investments in all ways that it can be leveraged. That is a quick snapshot of a very big report, and we encourage you to take a look at it I think there will be a link posted in the chat. But the most important part of an HIA is engaging quality stakeholders who are going to be the ones that are out sharing this information with decision makers. So I'm going to pass the microphone to Tiffany Marthaler, and she's going to tell you a little bit about her work. Next slide.
Thank you so much, Deborah and Rebecca. I'm Tiffany Marthaler. I am the Executive Director of the Kentucky Affordable Housing Coalition. And as Deborah mentioned, HB 86 is the creation of a state affordable housing tax credit, which is very similar to the federal low-income housing tax credit. So in essence, we'd be doubling the amount of resources available each year for the production of affordable housing. This is a program that has a proven track record. It's already been adopted in 20 different states. They've already enacted a state housing tax credit program. And so we're hoping that we are the next group to do that. And we look at this HB 86 as a long-term housing solution. Earlier on the call, and I know that a lot of people have talked about the influx of money that the states are receiving for short-term rental assistance. But we see HB 86 as a long-term solution, because once those resources dry up and those assistance funds aren't there anymore, we still have to house people, and we have to start now. And so our hope is with HB 86 is that we can start building affordable housing now, so that once these rental subsidies do dry up or are no longer available, that the housing units are there for people. When we talk with legislators and lawmakers about HB 86, we find out that we're often talking a lot about the economic impact of HB 86, such as increased property values, increased jobs, increased economic activity in the surrounding communities. But what we have found so beneficial about the housing impact analysis is that it stresses that affordable housing is truly about people. And sometimes that discussion gets lost a lot when you're talking about tax evaluations and different things like that stimulate the economy. And I think what this study brings to light is that when people are faced with housing instability, it can tremendously impact their physical and mental health. and that with the provision of stable, affordable housing, you can see lower healthcare costs in families, and you can see improved educational opportunities for children, and you can see a decrease in falls for seniors, like fall prevention activity. And so this document really provides the human story and the human side of affordable housing that we're also trying to communicate to our legislators as well. So this has been a very helpful and useful document for us. But in general, as Rebecca mentioned, this document can be used by a lot of different organizations for any kind of awareness. I've heard often on these calls, as well as other calls, that the healthcare industry refers to affordable housing as preventative medicine. And I completely agree with that. They both go hand in hand. And so some of our members have been able to use this document as a way of a resource and a tool to leverage other foundation grant monies to help them put healthcare and housing together. So we are very grateful to the folks at Louisville for doing this. And I also agree with Deborah by saying that there isn't a lot of information out there right now that couples healthcare and affordable housing together. And so for Kentucky, this is a great document to have. And I encourage other housing advocates to take a look at it and use the pieces they can to try to leverage more money to help them with their programs. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Tiffany, Deborah, Rebecca. What a helpful overview, and what good and interesting work you're doing. Thank you for that overview. Lots of people in the chat also thanking you. I believe we have put it looks like Elena has already put the link for the health impact assessment and the link for the Center for Health Equity's health impact assessment for affordable housing tax credits. There were a couple questions that I'll just throw out for any of you to answer. The first asking if you have a website that describes your program and its effectiveness, and whether you've influenced other Kentucky cities and counties to use your model.
I guess I can answer that. So we do have a website. It should be in the chat. And you know, the work that we do in terms of policy is pretty varied. So health impact assessment is one tool. One of the steps of an HIA is actually to evaluate both the process of doing the HIA, the potential outcomes of the HIA. And so that's built into the process itself. In terms of understanding our overall impact as a Center for Health Equity, I don't think we've ever really done a full comprehensive evaluation of that, but we do try to evaluate specific projects.
I will make a quick comment about other health impact assessment tools that we've used have been considered very valuable to for advocates. So we've used health impact assessment also to look at childcare funding as well as expungement, and the tool has helped inform policymakers and has passed policy, or we've been told by our advocates that they've been helpful for helping pass policy. So we hope that this particular set of research and information will also be helpful with this particular piece of legislation.
Thank you. And so related, a question from Linda Seltzer that I'll combine with a question from Jerry asking, how do you convince Republican state legislatures in Kentucky to vote in favor of housing in the state budget? And whether legislators are positively responsive to this mapping of policy changes that and the downstream impacts?
I think Tiffany would be a good one to speak to this if you're able.
Yeah. So the first part, you'll have to repeat that first part for me because I heard the second part more than the first.
Whoops, I just lost it. Let me see if I can find it again. I believe it was asking how or if you're able to convince Republican state legislators to vote in favor of housing in the state budget.
So we have been proposing this bill for the past couple of years, and we've had very strong representation from both sides of the aisle. And really, we really talk to everyone about the need of affordable housing. And we've not had a problem having both sides of the table come and support the bill.
Great.
And maybe to add to that, Tiffany, I think some of that is the framing where, you know, we're able to talk about, this kind of goes back to the framing of that we use in the Center for Health Equity, where we talk about how some upstream investments can help with some of the downstream impacts as well. So there is kind of that more health side, you know, you're incorporating lots of different types of arguments where overall the financial, personal, all of those investments align.
That's a good point, Rebecca. We have spent time on doing like an economic impact study. And along with this study, we've really been able to talk about the fact that, yes, you are investing X amount of dollars from the budget or reduction in revenues that will happen over the next course of 5 to 10 years. But here is your long-term return on investment. And I think that has really helped us when talking to folks, is that you are going to receive so many different returns from a community standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a job standpoint. So we've had to prepare those documents to explain to people that, yeah, it's an upfront investment, but over the next 20 to 30 years, that investment is going to triple coming back into your community. So.
Great, thanks, Tiffany, very helpful. That's all the questions for now, but Tiffany, Deborah, Rebecca, thank you so much for your work on this and really appreciate the presentation. Thanks for joining the call today.
Thank you.
Take care. I'm going to turn now to my colleague, Kim Johnson, who is going to speak to maybe some more details about what's happening next with Build Back Better and appropriations. Kim, I'll turn to you.
Thanks so much, Diane, and hi, everyone. I'm Kim Johnson, a senior policy analyst here at NLIHC, and I am filling in for Sarah today to bring you the latest updates from Capitol Hill. So I'll start out with appropriations just to mix it up a little bit in case folks are tired of hearing about Build Back Better. So the House passed last week a continuing resolution to keep the federal government funded through March 11th, which will buy lawmakers extra time to reach an agreement on and finalize a federal spending bill for fiscal year 2022. The Senate is expected to take up the measure this week before the current continuing resolution expires on February 18th. Last week, appropriations leaders in the House and Senate reportedly reached an agreement on top-line funding numbers for defense and non-defense discretionary programs. But the details of the agreement, including top-line funding numbers for the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Bill, have yet to be released. The FY22 appropriations process is very much delayed, thanks in large part to Republican attempts to push for parity between defense and non-defense spending programs. Democrats have been pushing for a significant increase to non-defense spending in this year's federal budget to make up for years of chronic underfunding of domestic programs under the Budget Control Act. Some Republicans have also been pushing for a full year continuing resolution, which would maintain FY 2021 funding for the full FY 22 fiscal year. It's important to know that flat funding for affordable housing programs acts as a cut. Because the cost of housing rises every year, funding for things like housing vouchers also needs to rise in order to maintain the current level of services and the number of households being served. Increased funding is particularly important given the massive increases in rental costs that are driving up inflation. Unless Congress passes a full spending bill and increases funding for vouchers, when there's turnover, PHAs will not issue new vouchers to families on waitlist. So in all, a full year CR, if a full year CR were enacted, we would be looking at about 100,000 fewer vouchers. So now is a great time for a final push. We are asking Congress to quickly enact an FY22 appropriations package with the highest possible funding for affordable housing and community development programs, and to include the House's proposal to expand housing vouchers to an additional 125,000 households. It is really important that advocates are calling their members of Congress, and in this case, especially anybody represented by a Republican member of Congress, to tell them that cuts to housing programs and other domestic priorities are unacceptable. Tell them to stop holding up negotiations and to pass a final bill as soon as possible. Also for fiscal year 2023, the White House has already signaled that the president's budget request, which kicks off the process of writing a new spending bill for a new fiscal year, will not come until sometime after the March 1st State of the Union address. So that's my update for appropriations. Now I'll jump into Build Back Better. Last weekend, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia said that Democrats must go through a committee process if the party wants to pass initiatives from the Build Back Better Act. He said that Republicans should have input, even if they ultimately do not vote for the bill, which no one expects that they would. As you all know, as we've talked about before, Democrats are using a process called budget reconciliation to allow them to pass the Build Back Better Act in the Senate with a simple majority of 51 votes rather than the 60 votes that are typically needed in the chamber. So we need every Democrat on board in order to see this bill enacted. Manchin also said that Congress must first address other priorities like passing a final spending bill for fiscal year 2022 and addressing inflation before taking up Build Back Better. While Manchin is clearly trying to slow the process down, House Democrats, including both progressive and moderates, are warning that a delay in reviving the Build Back Better Act will put the entire bill at risk. Progressives, led by Representative Camilla Jayapal, suggested March 1st as a deadline for taking action on the Build Back Better Act so that President Biden can promote it at the State of the Union address, but it seems very likely that March 1st will come and go without much progress being made on the bill. House Democrats are still optimistic that something is going to get done, even if they don't yet know what that bill is going to look like. The one thing that is clear is that whatever comes out of the Senate is going to look drastically different from the House-passed bill. White House officials and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi are reportedly considering recasting the package as a tool to reduce inflation and address the federal deficit. And that's why it's still incredibly important that housing advocates continue to weigh in with their senators and representatives in support of the Build Back Better Act's housing investments, including historic investments in housing vouchers, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund. We know that the White House is focused on its top 4 priorities of pre-K, childcare, climate change, and health provisions, and not on housing. And don't get us wrong, those are important provisions, and we need money for housing desperately. So we have to be extremely engaged and active to make sure housing stays part of any reconciliation bill that advances. There's also been some talk about, like was said earlier, about anything that doesn't make it into the reconciliation bill being repackaged into other smaller bills that would pass through regular order. But again, let's be very clear, the only path forward this year is going to be through a reconciliation bill. That's because, again, reconciliation bills can pass with a simple majority instead of 60 votes. And if housing is not in the reconciliation bill and is repackaged into a separate, smaller bill, it would need 10 Republicans and separate floor time in the Senate during an election year and in the midst of a new Supreme Court nomination. So that is very unlikely to happen. The reconciliation bill is really our best and in many cases only opportunity this year to pass the housing provisions in Build Back Better, including the $25 billion for housing vouchers, $65 billion for public housing, and $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund that we all have been working so hard over the last year to see enacted. So that is it for my legislative update. Happy to turn it back over to you, Diane, and answer any questions.
Great, thanks very much, Kim. We don't have any specific questions for now, so I appreciate that thorough overview and just would reiterate to everybody on the call that it's as important as ever to keep urging your member of Congress to push forward the Build Back Better housing investments and to get these much needed increases in a final appropriations bill for this year. So thanks for those updates, Kim. And now I'm going to turn to my colleague, Jen Butler, who is Senior Director of Media Relations and Communications at NLHC, to talk some more about today's day of action and what's next. Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Diane. Good afternoon. Thank you everyone who participated in our Valentine's Day of Action today. We definitely showed up today and we showed love for housing investments and Build Back Better. We'd like to give a very special thanks to the 20 members of Congress who participated in our tweet storm today and all of our partner organizations who helped to mobilize and activate. Our day of action so far has been very successful. We had nearly 1,000 participants, and in our tweet storm, our hashtag home is where the home is where the heart is, had a reach of 800,000. And our hashtag show housing love had a reach of over 900,000. We also like to thank everyone who used hashtag HoUSed in your posts as well, because overall that was just a fantastic job well done to everyone. But it certainly isn't over until it's over. We really do encourage everyone to visit nlihc.org/HoUSed, and there is going to have our advocacy toolkit that has all the talking points, templates, content for social media, and other useful resources to help you in your efforts and your outreach to your members of Congress. We also invite you to connect with our field team for any helpful tips and guidance on organizing, and you can email them at outreach@nlihc.org. at nlihc.org. And then please, for anything communications related, do feel free to reach out to me directly at jbutler@nlihc.org. Again, thank you so much, and we appreciate your partnership. Let's keep going.
Great, thanks so much, Jen. Thanks for that update, and thanks for your and the team's work in putting together great content and visuals and videos for everybody to use to get such attention. Nearly 1 million, a reach of nearly 1 million in a relatively short tweet storm is terrific progress. So I just want to echo Jen's thanks to everybody again, to say thank you for participating in the tweet storm. Thanks for participating in the Day of Action. Thanks for all of your incredible effective advocacy over the last couple of years and recent months. And please do keep it up. It's a critical time for affordable housing. We're so close. We have these incredible investments right within our grasp. We will keep pushing, and with leaders and champions like Chairwoman Maxine Waters, I am sure that we will prevail. So thanks again, take care, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.